and welcome back. A couple of weeks ago, I was given this set of old marching tenors by a school where I teach drumline. Now, marching isn't really my passion or strong suit, but I do have a lot of students in both middle and high school that play in their school bands, and pretty frequently I'll have students who want to work on this music in their lessons with me. Now for snare, it's easy enough to just work on a practice pad, and for the students who are on bass drum or cymbals, the parts tend to be simpler and don't require the extra work. But I've always struggled to have an efficient way to practice tenors with students, so it's been on my mind for quite some time to get something I can use for teaching. I'm not really a fan of owning a set of standard quads or quints because 1, they are fairly loud, and 2, they take up a lot of room. But I'm also not a huge fan of the tenor practice pads available on the market, mostly just because of how expensive they are. So upon getting this set of quads, I decided I wanted to try to make my own hybrid tenor practice pad that could incorporate some portion of these shells mounted to a base similar to the practice pads, but while still tensioning the heads and hoops like a full set. Before getting too far along with this project, I did take some measurements to have a sense of how to appropriately space these drums, but after that, my first step was breaking apart the tenors and removing all the tension rods, hoops, and heads, and then getting a screwdriver out to remove all the lugs and mounting hardware. Once I had the shells stripped, I went upstairs and started the process of removing the wrap. Typically on most drum shells, there's only adhesive near the seams and the bearing edges, but I learned pretty quickly that on these drums, it had a full layer of adhesive across the entire shell. After spending way too much time removing the wrap from the 10-inch drum, I figured it would be more efficient to cut these shells down first, and then remove the wrap after from the smaller sections I'd cut off and actually need. I didn't go in with too much of a plan for how tall I wanted these shells to be, but I knew I'd at least need to be able to stretch the heads over the bearing edges, so I went with 2 inches to start, knowing that if I wanted them to be shorter later, I could just trim them all again. Next, I stripped off all the wraps on the rest of the shells and spent a little bit of time sanding them after, just to smooth out the surface from where there was some buildup from the adhesive and wrap. After that, I took some scrap wood from around my garage to trace the inside of each shell to cut out some plates that I could use to mount these shells to. They don't need to be perfect, but at least a good fit where I could glue and tack these shells to later. I ran to my local hardware store, Menards, so that I could pick up a 2-foot by 4-foot sheet of 3/4 inch thick plywood, and this set me back $20. When I got home, I got all the shells and laid them out on the plywood, and then added heads and hoops so I could get the placement right. But at this point, my camera died, so we'll just have to jump ahead to me cutting this piece out for you to see. Once I had the plywood cut, I laid the shells out back in place, and this is when I realized I made a huge mistake. I traced the shells onto the plywood, completely forgetting that the heads and hoops would extend out past the shell another ½ inch or so, meaning I had nowhere to run these tension rods through to secure everything together. So after another trip to Menards, I began take 2 of this build on a fresh sheet of plywood. I was able to use the first base as a template onto this new sheet of plywood, but then after I traced it out, I made sure to come back and not only trace the hoops, but also leave some wiggle room to where I cut out the new base. After making sure everything was going to work with tension rods this time, I went ahead and glued the plates and shells to the base, and then added some brad nails just to hold everything in place until the glue could dry. Next, I could come in and drill the holes for the tension rods, using the hoops as a template for where to drill. I took my time doing this, checking to make sure everything was fitting along the way, and I also added a countersink hole to the backside so that I could tighten the tension rods while still having them concealed and not sticking out from the bottom of the base. Once I had all the holes drilled, I took this back downstairs and spent some time tuning everything up and just checking to see if it would work as expected. Everything did seem to be working pretty well, so I then disassembled them once again to take them back upstairs for some sanding and finishing. At this point, I also decided it would be helpful to add a handle, so I drilled 2 large holes with a hole saw, and then came back and bridged those 2 holes together with the jigsaw. I would have liked to break these edges with the roundover bit on a router, but I didn't have the room to do so, so I'll have to make do with just sanding these edges. Next, I could begin finishing, and I decided to go with black spray paint as I thought it would hide most of the imperfections on the wood, and it saved me a whole lot of time from trying to sand out all of my measurement markings I had made along the way. After a couple coats of paint, with plenty of time to dry, I could take these back downstairs one final time to reassemble and test out. These did work really well, but I felt like they were still just a bit louder than I wanted, and the pitch was so high due to the solid bottom that it wasn't very pleasant to listen to. I'll drop in this quick clip with my camera audio so you can kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about. So the next day, I picked up some 1-inch thick craft foam and cut out some disc that I could add to the inside of each shell with the hopes of reducing the volume. This is a concept I've seen on those older Remo tunable practice pads with the plastic rims, and those have always felt pretty natural to me, so I figured I would try it here. This ended up working out perfectly and got these drums to not only be significantly quieter, but have a more accurate sound in terms of pitch. Here's a quick clip so you can hear them for yourself. Overall, I think these perform exactly as I need them to in order to work with students during their lessons. It's nice to be able to practice on real heads with accurate rebound and full rims to simulate rim shots. If I hadn't have made my fatal mistake on the first board, this project would have cost me right around $35 with the plywood and the foam, but I did have to drop an additional $20 for what I'll be labeling as research and development expenses. Aside from the performance of these practice tenors, I love how conveniently they function, just dropping on top of a keyboard X stand where you can still adjust the height for different players, and additionally, with how shallow these are, I can easily store them without taking up too much room. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this project, so leave a comment down below to let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel to stay up to date on future video releases. And until next time, thanks.